What I saw was that a dog that got hit by a car came into the emergency service overnight, and the emergency service or the emergency clinician diagnosed the dog with a femur fracture. The complicating things were that the dog was pretty aggressive, and so she couldn't necessarily do a perfect physical exam, but she could diagnose the fact that the leg was probably broken because it was very swollen and painful, and the dog wasn't walking at all. So the fact that the dog wasn't walking was a big clue to her that that leg was broken. And then the dog was transferred to another doctor that did the surgery to fix the leg, and then a couple days later the dog still wasn't getting up and moving around as it should. So it wasn't following the normal post-operative course. And what she then realized with the help of a neurologist was that actually the dog has some neurologic signs to the back legs and is still not walking and is painful over the spine. So they, with all that information, went ahead and did an MRI scan and diagnosed the dog with a spinal fracture. So we had a dog that came in that was a victim of trauma, and sort of the obvious thing was diagnosed and repaired, and it wasn't until days later that the more subtle lesion was identified. When that happens, you feel about that big, and you want to do nothing more than crawl up into a ball and not deal with anything for a while. And so it's this horrible pit in your stomach that you get when you realize something like that you've missed this major thing. It could have been in the beginning she would have done nothing different, and you would have fixed the fracture anyway, and she would have still spent all this money, but it's sure nice to know the complete picture ahead of time rather than getting part of the picture and then realizing the rest. It gives you a feeling of incompetence, and not that you are incompetent, but that's just how you feel, and it gives you a feeling of, you feel so guilty for not getting all that right for the owner. I think the biggest error in this case, if you look at the different types of them, was what's known as an anchoring bias. So the clinician saw a dog that couldn't walk, and he had a big swollen leg that had an obvious fracture in it, and we took x-rays and there was a fracture of that limb. Or they were anchored to the leg as the major injury that the dog had, and the reason why the dog wasn't walking. And it wasn't until that leg was repaired and the dog still wasn't walking and still painful that we sort of went back, or the clinicians went back and reevaluated the case. I think this is also a case of a bias called availability bias, where you tend to focus on what's common. I said before that femur fractures are common after being hit by a car, but spinal fractures are not common. So this, I think, is an example of the emergency clinician focusing on that femur fractures being something that's common, and that sort of just carried through. And that's, I guess, what you'd call academically an availability bias, because it saw and treated a common thing, but maybe did not pay enough attention to the uncommon things. So, the easiest way to prevent it, I think, is a couple things. One, you have to force yourself to do a complete physical exam on every patient. Even if you think you know what is right, you have to force yourself, or not, even if you think you know what the answer is, you have to look at everything. In this instance, even though the dog was aggressive and painful, we should have had it out. We should have done a neurologic exam, because a neurologic exam is part of our minimum database for animals that come in with trauma. So forcing yourself to do a good physical exam, I think, is a very important thing. Having other people follow behind you with a physical exam if you're not sure about it is a very helpful thing. Your peers and your coworkers are a great source of critique for your physical exam. I think having a healthy skepticism of your case, your diagnoses, until you're absolutely positive they're the right answer is another thing you can do. So always critically evaluate and objectively evaluate what you think is going on, because you can hopefully catch it before you actually make a mistake and say, hey, we need to go back and look at this. we call it tunnel visioning a lot, where you're so focused on one problem that you have blinders on to the other things that could possibly coming in.